What would you do if the boss who fired you was suddenly forced to work under you? Jamal Carter never expected to walk back into his old office as the new CEO. But as he stood at the front of the conference room, all eyes on him, he watched the man who once humiliated him sink into his chair, powerless. This wasn't about revenge. It was about rewriting the rules. Jamal stepped into the office, his polished shoes tapping lightly against the gleaming floors. Something felt off. The usual buzz of morning conversations was missing. Instead, there were hushed whispers, quick glances in his direction, and a strange tension thick in the air. His stomach tightened. This wasn't the atmosphere he expected on the day he thought he'd finally be getting that promotion. A notification popped up on his phone. Meeting with Mr. Harrington. Urgent. He exhaled, straightened his tie, and walked toward the executive suite, his confidence steady. After years of dedication, late nights, and outperforming expectations, this had to be the moment he'd been waiting for. As he entered, Mr. Harrington barely looked up. The middle-aged executive, dressed in an expensive navy suit, sat behind a grand mahogany desk, fingers steepled, a cold expression on his face. "Have a seat, Jamal." Jamal sat. Across the table, the air conditioning hummed softly. Then, without preamble, Harrington slid a sleek white envelope toward him. Jamal frowned, hesitating before picking it up. His eyes scanned the bold, heart-dropping words at the top of the letter. His breath hitched. His pulse pounded in his ears. "This must be a mistake," he said, keeping his voice even. "I'm one of the top performers in the company. My quarterly reports are—" "We're restructuring," Harrington interrupted flatly, leaning back in his chair. His fingers tapped lazily against the armrest. "Nothing personal, just business." Jamal swallowed hard, his jaw clenching. "Business? I've brought in more revenue than half the department combined. I was on track for a leadership role." Harrington finally met his gaze, and Jamal noticed something in his smirk. Something smug, calculated. "Listen," Harrington sighed, feigning disappointment. "We just don't think you're the right fit for where this company is heading." Jamal's fist curled on his lap. There it was. The word dripped with meaning. He had heard it before, coded in boardrooms and networking events. A subtle, unspoken way of saying, "You don't belong here." Jamal took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay composed. "So that's what this is about?" Harrington gave a nonchalant shrug. "Take it how you want. HR has your severance details. Security will escort you out." Jamal's entire body burned with anger, but he refused to let it show. He stood slowly, adjusting his suit jacket. "You're making a mistake." Harrington chuckled, shaking his head. "Number you made the mistake of thinking this place was ever going to let someone like you rise." Jamal froze. The words were spoken so casually, yet they cut like a blade. His heart pounded, but his face remained unreadable. He forced a polite smile and reached for the termination letter, slipping it into his pocket. Then, with measured steps, he turned and walked out, head held high. The moment he stepped into the hallway, whispers filled the space. Some co-workers looked away, others stole quick glances. And as Jamal neared the exit, he heard it. Harrington's voice, smug and amused, drifting from inside the office. "That's one less problem to deal with." Jamal stopped. His jaw tightened. Then he stepped forward, out of the office, out of the company, and straight into the beginning of something greater. And one day, Harrington would regret this moment. He just didn't know it yet. Jamal stepped out of Harrington's office, his mind a battlefield of rage and restraint. His grip tightened around the termination letter in his pocket, but his posture remained upright. He refused to let them see him break. As he walked through the office, the air felt different, charged with tension, filled with unspoken words. Some colleagues avoided his eyes, suddenly immersed in their computer screens. Others whispered behind cupped hands, their glances flicking between him and the security guard, now trailing behind him. Security. As if he were some criminal being escorted out. Jamal forced himself to breathe evenly. He had given this company 5 years. 5 years of late nights, exceeding expectations, mentoring junior employees. And now he was nothing more than a scene in today's office gossip. Near the break room, a few familiar faces hesitated. Sarah, one of the junior analysts he had trained, stepped forward as if to say something, but then, catching the disapproving look from a senior manager, she shrank back. Jamal gave her a small nod. He understood. Speaking up could cost her, but that didn't make the silence any less bitter. As he passed the conference room, the door stood slightly ajar. Inside, Harrington was laughing. Jamal slowed his pace. "That's one less problem to deal with." Harrington chuckled, his voice dripping with smug satisfaction. A wave of heat rose in Jamal's chest. His fingers curled into fists. Problem? That's all he had ever been to them. He turned his head slightly, just enough to see through the glass wall. Inside, Harrington leaned back in his chair, grinning at another executive. They clinked their coffee mugs together, as if celebrating. Jamal clenched his jaw. He wanted to storm in, throw the resignation letter back at him, demand to know how being excellent at his job had made him a problem. But he didn't. Instead, he did something that surprised even himself. He smiled, a slow, knowing smile. One that said, "Enjoy this moment, Harrington, because it won't last forever." Without another glance, he walked toward the glass doors of the lobby. The security guard stopped at the entrance, giving him a slight nod, almost as if he felt the unfairness of the situation, but couldn't say it out loud. Jamal stepped outside, letting the cold air hit his face. The anger in his chest simmered, but something stronger started to take its place. Determination. This wasn't the end. No, this was just the beginning. He wasn't done yet. Jamal sat in his tiny apartment, staring at the termination letter crumpled in his hands. The humiliation of that day still burned inside him. Harrington's smirk, the security guard's firm grip on his arm, the whispers, the pity, the laughter. It all replayed in his mind like a cruel movie on repeat. Then something inside him shifted. I'm not done. Not even close. The fire inside him turned into fuel. He wasn't going to let this define him. If they thought they could crush him, they had no idea who they were dealing with. That same night, Jamal sat at his desk, opened his laptop, and started researching business programs. His savings were limited and the bills were piling up, but he refused to back down. He found an affordable night school program and enrolled the next day. Jamal worked relentlessly. He attended classes at night, took side gigs during the day, and barely slept. There were days when exhaustion clawed at him, days when he questioned himself, when he sat alone in his car, gripping the steering wheel, wondering if he was making a mistake. But every time doubt crept in, he heard Harrington's voice. "You people just don't fit in here." Jamal used that as fuel. He started networking, making connections with entrepreneurs, learning everything he could about business and leadership. Slowly, his confidence grew. One day in an entrepreneurship class, he had an idea, something that could change the game. A financial consulting firm designed specifically for undervalued businesses. Companies run by hardworking, talented individuals who just needed a chance. He started small, taking on struggling businesses, helping them restructure, teaching them how to win. And it worked. Within 2 years, his company exploded. Clients poured in. Investors took notice. Money started flowing. One morning, he woke up to an email that made his hands tremble. A powerful investment firm wanted to partner with him. They had a list of struggling companies they wanted him to turn around. If he succeeded, he would be in control of major corporate players. Jamal scrolled through the list. His breath caught. At the very top was a company on the verge of collapse. Harrington and Company. Jamal leaned back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Looks like it's my turn now." Jamal sat in his sleek, glass-walled office, scanning through a stack of acquisition proposals. His company was thriving. Clients lined up to work with him, investors trusted his vision, and his name carried weight in the industry. But nothing could have prepared him for this. As he flipped through the next file, his eyes landed on a familiar name. Jamal's pulse slowed. For a moment, he just stared, memories of that humiliating day flooding back. The way Harrington had smirked as he slid that termination letter across the desk, the security escort, the whispers. And now Harrington's company was failing. Jamal leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Poetic justice had just knocked on his door. He skimmed through the report. Massive debt, declining revenue, leadership failures. Harrington's arrogance had finally caught up with him. The company needed urgent intervention. The board was desperately looking for a strong, strategic CEO to turn things around before they were forced into bankruptcy. And now they were unknowingly offering Jamal full control. He chuckled under his breath. I wonder if Harrington even knows how bad things are. Jamal didn't need to think twice. This was his moment, but he wasn't about to waste it on revenge. He had a better idea. He picked up the phone. Let's move forward with the Harrington acquisition. I'll sign the papers today. His assistant hesitated. You sure? That's a personal one, isn't it? Jamal smirked. Exactly. That's why I won't say a word. Let's keep my name out of it until the transition is complete. She nodded. Understood. The next morning, Harrington's board of directors received the news. A mystery investor had officially acquired majority control of the company. Rumors spread quickly. Employees whispered about who the new CEO might be. Harrington himself was in a state of denial. This is ridiculous, he scoffed to his colleagues. Some corporate big shot thinks they can just walk in and fix my company? I built this place. I'll handle it. But behind closed doors, he was panicking. The company's downfall was inevitable, unless this new CEO pulled off a miracle. 3 days later, the company announced a special staff meeting. The entire office gathered in the main conference room, buzzing with anticipation. Harrington sat at the head of the table, tapping his pen impatiently. Let's get this over with. Where is this so-called CEO? At that exact moment, the doors swung open, and Jamal Carter walked in. Silence. Harrington's face drained of all color. The conference room buzzed with anticipation. Employees murmured in hushed voices, exchanging nervous glances. Who was this mystery CEO that had swooped in to save the sinking company? Harrington sat at the head of the table, arms crossed, jaw clenched. He didn't like surprises, and today felt like a very bad surprise. For 3 days, the board had kept him in the dark. Who was this new executive? Why hadn't they consulted him? Harrington's gut told him this wasn't just any CEO. This was someone with power, someone who could change everything. He tapped his pen against the table impatiently, glaring at the door. Let's just get this over with, he muttered. The double doors swung open, and in walked Jamal Carter. A dead silence fell over the room. Harrington's face went pale, as if he had seen a ghost. The man he had fired without hesitation, humiliated in front of the entire office, now stood before him. But Jamal wasn't just some employee anymore. He was the boss. Jamal, dressed in a sharp navy blue suit, walked in with the confidence of a man who owned the room. Employees who had once ignored him now scrambled to their feet. Some exchanged stunned glances, whispering among themselves. Harrington's throat went dry. His hands clenched into fists under the table. This has to be a joke, he sputtered. What are you doing here? Jamal stopped in front of the long conference table, buttoned his suit jacket and smiled. Well, he said smoothly, I believe you already know, Harrington. But just in case you need me to say it, I'm your new boss. The air in the room felt electric. Some employees smirked, others stared in shock. Harrington's entire world had just flipped upside down. For a man who prided himself on being in control, Harrington looked utterly powerless. His usual arrogance had been replaced with something else, something Jamal had never seen before. Fear. It was written all over his face as Jamal stood at the head of the long, polished conference table. Every employee in the room held their breath, waiting for the next words to be spoken. Jamal let the silence stretch, watching as realization dawned on Harrington's face. The same man who had smirked while firing him, who had laughed as security escorted him out, was now shrinking in his chair. Jamal adjusted his cufflinks. He wasn't here for revenge. He was here for something better. Harrington forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. His fingers clutched the pen in front of him like a lifeline. Jamal, good to see you again. Jamal raised an eyebrow. Oh, so now it's good to see you? He stepped forward, placing both hands on the table and leaning in slightly. It's Mr. Carter now. Harrington swallowed hard. Of course, Mr. Carter, he corrected quickly. I didn't realize you'd be taking over, but I'm sure we'll work well together. Jamal smiled. Calm, controlled, dangerous. That depends, he said smoothly. The employees watched in stunned silence. They had witnessed Harrington's cruelty before, his sharp tongue, his ruthless decisions, his condescending attitude. But now Now he was the one scrambling to keep his composure, and they were loving every second of it. Jamal walked to the head of the table, the seat that once belonged to Harrington. He placed his hands on the chair, his fingers tapping the leather armrest deliberately. "I remember sitting in that chair, across from you," Jamal said, tilting his head slightly. Harrington stiffened. "You didn't even look me in the eye when you fired me," Jamal continued. "Said I wasn't a fit here." Harrington opened his mouth, but Jamal held up a hand. "But here's the funny thing." Jamal slowly lowered himself into the chair. "Now I decide who fits." Harrington looked sick, his shoulders slumped as if the weight of the entire room had collapsed on him. Jamal smiled, not out of spite, not out of malice, but out of certainty. He had won, but he wasn't done yet. "I look forward to working with you." He paused, his voice dropping just slightly. "For now." Harrington's face lost all color. Jamal turned and walked toward his new office, knowing full well that Harrington wouldn't be sleeping well tonight. Jamal leaned back in his chair, fingers interlocked, watching Harrington squirm. The man who had once towered over him with arrogance now looked small, fragile, breakable. You're keeping me on?" Harrington stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Jamal tilted his head, a slow, deliberate smile forming. "Oh, I'm keeping you, Harrington. But not in the way you think." The boardroom remained dead silent. Employees exchanged nervous glances, waiting to see what Jamal would do next. Firing Harrington would have been easy, a satisfying, clean-cut punishment. But Jamal had something better in mind. Jamal stood, adjusting his cufflinks. "I've reviewed your performance, and I think we found a position more suited to your abilities." Harrington swallowed. I don't understand." Jamal motioned toward the glass windows, overlooking the busy office floor. "You see all those employees out there? The ones you belittled, walked past without a glance? The ones you treated like dirt?" Harrington's jaw tightened. "They're your new bosses." A ripple of shock and amusement swept through the room. Jamal continued, his tone calm but firm. "You'll be reporting to the people you dismissed, the people you made miserable." Harrington's face turned bright red. "You can't be serious," he muttered. Jamal raised an eyebrow. "Oh, but I am." Harrington gripped the chair, knuckles white. "This is humiliating." Jamal's voice hardened. "So was what you did to every employee here." Jamal stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Harrington could hear. "I could have fired you today, but that would have been too easy." He let the words sink in. "This way, you get to experience exactly what it feels like to be powerless." Jamal turned away, leaving Harrington standing in stunned silence. As he walked toward his office, he couldn't help but smile. Some lessons, after all, needed to be felt. The office buzzed with a new energy, a shift so palpable that even the walls seemed to breathe easier. Jamal walked through the halls, his presence no longer that of an outsider, but a leader. Employees who once feared Harrington now stood taller, bolder, freer. Harrington, on the other hand, moved quietly, his gaze cast downward, no longer the untouchable boss. Justice had been served, but Jamal wasn't done yet. The company had been through years of toxicity, but today the air felt different. Jamal had rewritten the rules, and everyone knew it. Now it was time to ensure the change lasted. Jamal called a staff-wide meeting in the main conference room. The employees, once used to walking on eggshells, took their seats with a newfound confidence. He stood at the front, looking over the team that had endured so much. "This company was built on talent," he began, "but for too long, that talent was overlooked." A murmur of agreement spread through the room. "No more," he declared. "From today, this place will be built on merit, respect, and equal opportunity." Applause erupted. For the first time, employees felt valued. At the back of the room, Harrington sat stiffly, his face unreadable. The man who had once ruled with intimidation was now irrelevant. Jamal met his eyes for a brief moment. Harrington stood abruptly and walked out without a word. No one stopped him. No one cared. Later that evening, Jamal sat in his new office, gazing out at the city skyline. His assistant entered, placing a glass of whiskey on his desk. "You really let him walk away?" she asked. Jamal smirked. "People like him don't last in places built on fairness." She nodded, watching as he picked up a framed photo. His first day at the company, full of hope. Now he wasn't just an employee, he was the one shaping the future. Success wasn't about revenge, it was about rewriting the rules.